Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Icelandic Roots podcast. I am your host, Jack, and in this conversation, I sat down with Mark Petursson as he shared stories about his time spent living and working in Iceland in the 1970s. We talk about what it was like for him learning the Icelandic language and how he benefited from being a Western Icelander living in Iceland at that time. Then we bring things up to the modern day and talk about things that Mark is doing still involved with the Western Icelander communities. I hope you enjoy this conversation and stay tuned for more discussions just like this one. Just give us a little introduction on yourself, Mark.
So my name is Mark Petursson, Martin Allen Petursson, and I'm 68 years old. Sorry.
Missed the decade.
Okay, I missed the decade. 68 years old. I'm originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, born in the west end of Winnipeg is what they call it, which is now nowhere near the west end of Winnipeg. But
as it goes.
Yeah, and then we did move out farther west. But so born and raised in Winnipeg and of Icelandic descent. 15
On both sides.
On both sides, yeah. I'm 15/16 Icelandic.
Okay. And you're also the president now of the Leif Eiriksson Icelandic Club.
Yes, I am.
Calgary.
And vice president of the Icelandic National League of North America.
Okay, right. I don't think I realized that.
Yeah.
How long have you done that for?
Just a year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
So busy guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it sort of pushed me out of working for a living. Now I'm fully retired.
Well, that's good. I really, I think you, just in the few years that I've known you, done a lot to promote like the different programs like Snorri that the club encourages, and just the other events. We had a fun time at the Christmas dinner, which was not this last year, but I guess the year before, where we kind of did a job of co-hosting it.
It was awesome.
But actually, this will lead to a fun story that you can tell us right now, because we were talking about microphones, which you can tell us a cool fact about. But that Christmas dinner that we kind of co-hosted together, we actually had microphone issues.
Yes.
And we had to use the power of the old school way of orating and just using our voices, projecting our voices.
Fortunately, we both have the ability to project our voices.
Yes.
And it did prompt me to go and get instructions on how to use the microphone. So now we actually have the ability to use them at common functions, which has been a problem for a while before. But yeah, the interesting tidbit. So on my drive here, I was listening to Peter Mansbridge. He has a podcast that I find interesting. I listened to it on Canada Talks on Sirius. And he was saying that the microphone, the first use of a microphone to record audio was 100 years ago. He said today, but he said it may just be this week. But certainly 100 years ago was the first time that the microphone was used to record audio.
Yeah.
And here we are recording audio using a
microphone.
100-year-old device, which isn't that long ago, really.
No, certainly not. And
shocking.
If we think about right now, we're using two little Bluetooth microphones that are connected to my smartphone. And then I have a backup mic just in case. But the fact that we have these different options is pretty incredible how advanced they become.
Yeah. And this will end up being able to be listened to from around the world.
On demand, yes, instantaneously. And around the world indeed. It's quite cool. We can look at the statistics of the podcast, and you get the odd, listen in Mexico or in Australia, and these totally different countries. And sometimes I think that gets a little confused. You can like set up your phone differently, so it's not always your precise location.
Yes. Yeah. I can put on my VPN and pretend I'm listening to it from somewhere strange. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think for the most part, it's
it's accurate.
Yeah. So that's a cool little tidbit for sure.
And one of the little meanderings of the way this is likely to go. So 50 years ago right now, I was living in Iceland. We will get into that. But when we were living there, I would talk on the phone to my family in Canada, in Winnipeg, on occasion. When they needed to talk to me, they would send me a telegram and give me a time to call them, and I would have to go walk to the telephone building and talk to the operator and then call. And invariably, they would all be gathered together. My parents, my siblings, and my grandparents would be gathered together. So each one of them would have a short hello.
Right.
You know, there was no FaceTime.
Yes.
There was no emails. But, and my grandfather, Petursson, Bill Petursson, he had lived in Iceland when he was in his 20s for a year to learn Icelandic. Anyways, he would invariably say, "Wow, Mark, this is amazing. It sounds like you're right next door.
Wow.
This is so incredible. Just imagine what it's like." He says, "When I was living in Iceland, I would have to write a letter and send it, and it would take weeks, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there saying, Grandpa, this is costing me $5 a minute." I think it was around $5 to $10 a minute.
Wow.
For this that I had to pay cash, because there's no credit cards at my end. So I always had to go with a pocket full of money.
Wow.
And pay in Icelandic kroner, of course. Yeah. And he'd say he would waste at least a minute every time.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. And nowadays, I'm just thinking as you say that, first of all, we forget how amazing it truly is.
Yeah.
And not only talking, but FaceTiming. Yeah, you can see exactly. But also, like, we forget about the cost too, because of course we are still paying our monthly phone bill. And here in Canada, for those listening in the States or elsewhere, we actually have pretty high phone bills, relatively to other places in the world. But also, you can just use Wi-Fi, which can be oftentimes accessed for free. So we don't really think about the cost anymore of that either.
No. And even when you do spend it, it is a very, very small part.
Yes, comparatively, for sure. The prices have come down in a really quite dramatic way. Yeah, well, that's quite fascinating. And Peter Mansbridge is really a cool Canadian broadcaster. Yeah, he's a great fellow to learn from. So I was researching our connection together.
Cool.
Using the Icelandic Roots genealogy database, of course.
Which I love using, by the way.
Yes, wonderful.
Every time I meet somebody that has Icelandic heritage, the first thing I do is pop open my phone and check out how are you related.
Yes, I always try to explain to people, like at work, for example, or just friends that I have, like if we were in Iceland right now, we could just look each other up. We can do that too if we're not in Iceland, but we have to have the Icelandic ancestry.
Yes.
To use Icelandic roots. But in Iceland, they're doing that all the time, which is just such a incredible aspect of the Icelandic culture, which is very interesting. And so for us, I found that we have 4 common ancestors.
Cool.
And from those, 2 of them are on your mother's side, which with those 2, it makes us 8 half cousins, once removed.
Yeah.
And then there's 2 on your father's side, which makes us 9th cousins. And for me, they're both on my Avi's side, which I find interesting because for my mom's heritage, that's my only Icelandic side, oftentimes there's connections through both my Amma and my Avi's. So for us, it's both of these connections are just on my Avi's side. And those common ancestors of ours go back to around like the 1600s, mid 1600s to early 1700s. I didn't write down their name in my notes here. I don't know how good your genealogy take is, but I didn't think, that would really, it's getting lost in history at that point, right?
Yeah. Unless they were some kind of a famous person, it would not make too much difference. But that's interesting. It's also very cool that if you're connected through like the multiple people, and if we did an actual DNA test, our DNA test, where you said like 8th cousins approximately?
Yeah, 8th cousins and 9th cousins, depending on the ancestor.
Yeah. A DNA test, we would appear to be 6th cousins or 5th cousins.
Oh, interesting.
Because we have multiple connections.
Right.
Margaret from our club, her and I on 23andMe show as 3rd cousins, but through the database, where the closest is about 5th or 6th cousins.
Right.
But our DNA appears, because her and I have about 8 common ancestors. So
Okay.
it's interesting.
And is that just because, and I know you're not a DNA expert, but I'm always trying to think about these differences, and we've had discussions on the podcast about that as well. And I guess genealogy in that sense can be much more accurate in a way because of the you can figure out who that ancestor is, whereas DNA, it's kind of a bit more mixed and mingling and across time, right? So
with the DNA and having multiple common ancestors, it's more like a spider web connection,
right,
where each person you're more or less a straight line, you know, mother, grandmother, great grandmother connection. But if you also have multiple ones, and those people have interconnection, is because Iceland,
which is very
country, it's there's many. Yeah, my mother's grandparents were first cousins, so
right,
there are multiple connections
on a genetic level.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and in some ways, so yeah, you can get a more clean tracing with genealogy.
Yes.
But that, of course, can be not exactly as accurate as DNA because, of course, the genealogy connections could be mixed up. Somewhere along the line, this person's name was recorded here when it actually should have been recorded there, or there was an adoption that wasn't actually listed as an adoption or something like this. So both have their benefits, but both have their potential.
Human error can come into the genealogy record. Having said that, it still seems to be strikingly accurate.
Yes, especially in the Icelandic side of things. It seems to be pretty spot on, which is quite cool. Now, from that, I kind of and we were spending a bit of time in the library before you came here. And also, I should say to listeners, if they've heard at all a dog barking, I hope it's not going to pick up on the mics here, but we are just in the Scandinavian Center Library, and there's some other stuff going on down the hall, so I apologize if there's any other background noise. But this, of course, is a very great little area for research, and there's lots of opportunities for perusing the Icelandic library. And so I was looking into a little bit about what was going on in Iceland in the 1600s. And I want to bring this up to closer in time and hear a bit about your experience when you're in Iceland. But I just thought this was really interesting to go over and to think about our common ancestors from, what would that be, 400-ish years ago?
Yeah.
Pretty crazy to say.
It is.
So the Danish crown controlled much of Iceland during that time. I think it was like mid 1600s when they really kind of dominated trade and restricted a lot of economic growth because all trade had to go through Denmark, and they really controlled that. And so I don't know what they were thinking at the time, but it seems a little rude to the Icelandic people because that caused them to really live like this subsistence lifestyle, and it really limited a lot of their opportunities. And that time period, I think it was like 1400s to 1700s maybe, was like considered the Little Ice Age. And so the climate around that time was a little colder than average. And you imagine a little bit colder in Iceland, you would feel that. It's already quite cold there on a normal time. So a little bit colder means for a little bit more poverty, a little bit more hardship. And of course, their time then was like just sheep farming, fishing, and living in turf houses. So you can imagine the hardships of people around then. And also I found interesting, there's a little book on it here. This was around the time period when they had witch hunts in Iceland. And I remember learning this at some point before, that it was a lot different than witch hunts in other European countries, whereas these ones actually usually targeted men because it was men who would practice magic or follow magic. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term. It's Galdr, Galdr in Icelandic.
Yeah.
And so the Danish authority around that time, they were trying to stamp out any people practicing magic. And so their witch hunts around that time usually resulted in prosecuting men and not women, which was, as we know, most of European culture at that time. And then the last few points was, of course, the positives, and this is true across most of Icelandic history, which despite their isolation, despite their poverty, they maintained their literary agency. So we can imagine those common ancestors in their turf houses reading the Icelandic sagas, and different than most other Europeans that lived in poverty, the Icelanders who were living in poverty, they had their literary culture, and they maintained a high level of I would say, like, intellectual awareness.
Not just reading, but writing.
Yes, right.
And shocking when you think in a turf house, when you have a very, very long night, you're doing that to the light of a lamp that is fed with probably tallow from the sheep, or possibly whale oil.
Yeah, I don't know at what point they were using whale oil for those sorts of things, but yeah, that would be costly during the long Icelandic winters. You had to invest a lot to light up the turf houses.
Yes.
And to do that, to write and to read. And then the final point is they were also, even though the ultimate power rested with Danish officials, of course, they were still practicing their local assembly at the Althing.
Yeah.
So throughout all the dark years, the Icelanders, they persevered, and it's so incredible. And I just love to bring that historical context when we look at the familial connections.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
Very tough life.
Tough life, but then we connect that all the way up to where we've come today. And Iceland, it blows me away how productive they are, how safe and a secure country they are, how intelligent they are, and they're just such a shining light in all of the world in terms of a culture and a community of people. But I know that that's changed rapidly too. So let's bring it then to the time when you were in Iceland, and I would love to hear some stories about that.
So in 1972, so this is 2 years before I went to live there.
Okay.
I was lucky. My grandfather and grandmother, my dad's mother and father, and that I called them grandma and grandpa.
Okay.
My mother's father was my ave.
Okay.
My mother's mother passed away when my mother was 13, so I never ever met her.
Okay.
She would have been my ama, but I never met her. So
Can I ask you a quick question on that source? What was the difference in to use grandma and grandpa, even though they were still Icelandic on that side?
yeah, they were all Icelandic.
Okay.
But
Were they a bit more like assimilated?
no, it would just be less confusing
Okay,
for the grandchildren. If you have ave and ave, then it gets confusing, right?
Yeah.
So it's easier to have an ave and a grandpa. They have different names then, right? Otherwise you have to work up some kind of a weird way of calling them whatever you call them. Sure. And I believe that's the reason. As a child, I just knew them as that. So it's,
You didn't question it.
they do question it. Yeah. But my grandpa, my dad's dad, took the whole family to Iceland for a 6-week vacation. So in 1972, got on a plane, went over to Scotland and then to Iceland, and spent 6 weeks in Iceland. That's my 3 siblings, my parents, and my grandparents, two of my grandparents. So the 6 of us.
Wow.
8 of us, sorry, there's 8 of us there. And so I spent 6 weeks in Iceland, which is a pretty long holiday.
That's like the Snorri trip that I did.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Interestingly enough, thinking about that, so it's like I was a Snorri before Snorri.
Sure, yeah.
But during that 1972 trip, we took a bus trip from Reykjavik to Akureyri.
Wow.
And went and saw sights. There were no tunnels underwater. There was no this was a long, long bus trip along winding roads in and out of the fjords. And but very interestingly enough, this trip had a bunch of people from the Vancouver Icelandic clubs and Blaine, Washington.
Okay.
And there's a member of the Blaine, Washington area of the Icelandic National League of the U.S., Rob, who was on that bus with me in 1972.
Wow.
He didn't remember me, but he remembered my little sister.
Okay.
So, but yeah, we were on that together, and now he's active in the INL US.
Okay. Wow.
The Canadian branch.
Yeah.
So again, introducing young people to Iceland has an infectious
Yes.
trait, which obviously you're doing what you're doing. But anyway, so that was 1972. I got to go, and you couldn't drive to Hubni Hortnafjörður. You couldn't go along the south coast. There wasn't a road.
Wow.
So we would flew to Hub because I had relatives there. We drove up to Akureyri. We spent a lot of time being introduced to our relatives and walking all around Iceland.
Wow.
It was a great trip. Came back home, and 2 years later, I was graduating from high school. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew that I was eventually going to go to university and get a degree in something. I didn't know what, but I wanted to go and take a year off. I was also the youngest. I was born in December, so I was younger than all my contemporaries. And so I thought that wouldn't hurt to take a year off. At that time, a lot of people would go and travel around Europe for $1 a day. There were books written about that. And I had no desire to go and see places. I wanted to go and, sort of become an Icelander. It was my goal. Also, I just wanted to go and party and take a year off. Like, to be honest with you, so I made the plan.
Bit of both, though.
Yeah, a bit of both. Oh yeah, for sure. I made plans. One of my high school friends, a non-Icelander, he'd said, yeah, well, you're going, I'm going too. So he came with me. One of my other friends he is Icelandic, Western Icelandic. He came over and joined us a couple of months later. So we went over in September of 1974. And in September 1974, we landed on a plane in Reykjavik, Keflavik, got to Reykjavik. Were picked up by relatives. My grandfather had set up the whole trip, but not the whole trip. He had made the connections to get us a job in Hubni Hortnafjörður, working construction, building the new fish factory. I still call it the new fish factory. It's 50 years old. And when you go there, it's still a new fish factory.
Okay. Is it still in operation?
It's still in operation.
Wow. Okay. That's impressive.
So we landed in Reykjavik. We hadn't taken all of our clothes because we were going to buy some of the good warm gear when we landed, which we did. We went to a store. This is an interesting little sub-story to tell you how amazing the Icelandic people are. We went to a store and I bought a lopapeysa and I bought some warm mitts and toque and a bunch of gear. I bought a bunch of little grade 1 reading books, which we were using last night at the Icelandic lessons because I wanted to use Icelandic, grade 1 readers to help teach me how to speak Icelandic. And I tried to pay using a Canadian traveler's check. Again, there was no such thing at that time of having credit cards, and I didn't have any Icelandic money with me. So I tried to use a Canadian dollar traveler's check, and the owner of the store said she would not accept my money. And I was kind of distraught. And she said, because I had told her, she says, what are you doing? I said, I'm moving to Hub and I need this stuff because I'm moving there. She said, well, it was a Saturday. She said, tomorrow, the Icelandic krona will be devalued 30%. She says, if I accept your Canadian money at the value of the krona today, I'm stealing 30% of your money. She says, take all this stuff. You go to Hub. When you get your first paycheck, send me the money.
Wow.
So we walked out of the store with all our stuff. We paid no money at all. I said, well, how can you do that? She says, I know where you're going.
I was just thinking, I'm thinking the same thing. Like, how could they trust that? But it's like the small community aspect.
Exactly. I was going to a small town of a few thousand people. It's not like I'm going to run away. So, and of course, in the long run, I'm sure it benefited her because whenever I would go to I would go to that store first. So I did go and spend a lot more money there in the long run. But it was an amazing,
a testament
to it. Yeah, how amazing the people can be. So, anyways, we ended up going and moving to Hub, and we started working construction. I spoke almost no Icelandic. I had been raised in Canada with Icelandic being spoken around me to a certain extent by my grandparents. My parents didn't speak it very much Icelandic. They understood a lot, but they didn't speak it. So I could speak food Icelandic. I knew Helgikjött and I knew Rúllupylsa and Vínaterta, which wasn't that useful in Icelandic. So I knew some of that. Mólasekkur. I knew how to say that, which is a sugar cube. But we would, so I was starting to try to learn Icelandic. As I had said, I had these grade 1 reader books. I had them in my back pocket everywhere I went. And I would pop it out and I would ask people, what does this word mean and how do you say it? And one of the first lines I remember reading, it was from a book called Brennivín, and it was "Það reckoning úti," which means it is raining outside. So, which is a good one to learn.
You use that every day.
Yes, can use that one every day. So we got there middle of September. We were living in a small rooming house with a common bathroom for 6 rooms, and we started meeting people. Our lives fell into a fairly steady routine. You get up and go to work, get there 5 minutes late every day. The boss was pissed off at that. But we would, every Wednesday was bingo night. So we would go to the town hall. Wednesdays and Sundays, you could play bingo. Tuesdays and Thursdays were movie nights at the local community hall in Höfni. Saturday nights, there was a dance, and you would go there and all the young people would get together and dance and smuggle in Brennivín and Coke. We would frequently on the Friday night or Saturday night before the dance, we would go ruta, which is you get in somebody's car and just drive on a set route through the town. You would just go round and round in circles, and different people would have different routes and they would intersect. So you could always get out of one car and wait and hop in the next one.
Wow.
And it was a party on wheels. That was what the young people did.
Yeah.
And the law in Iceland was that you could drink in the car as long as you're not driving. A driver had to be 100% sober. Everybody else could be sipping on their Brennivín. So we would have the tunes cranked up. We would be singing and we would be driving, and so that was our life. And we worked this job of construction for a couple of months, and then we had an opportunity to go work in the herring business. They were the first herring fishery in 10 years, I think. It was a long time that they had shut the herring fishery down to allow the fish to come back. But they were having their first harvest of the herring, and we got to go and work on that, putting herring into barrels and salting them, and then tending those barrels and topping them up with water.
Wow.
Then we got a job in their regular fish factory where we were cutting and gutting fish that were coming in. At that point, I met a man who spoke 8 languages.
Wow.
He would work, he was an Icelander. He would work in Iceland until he had enough money to go to a country where he would want to learn their language. And he would travel there with the goal of learning the language.
Oh, so interesting.
And he would continue working. He would find little odd jobs. And so he would work for about 6 months in Iceland and then go away for 2 to 5 years.
Wow.
And then come back for 6 months and then 2 to 5 years. And so he would write on this board covered in fish blood the words as I was learning them. And I would say I learned more from him than anybody else.
Okay. But that would be the guy to learn from because he's experienced learning the other languages. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was his whole, he was not married. He never had kids. That was his goal. And he lived a great life.
Yeah.
So I did every job that you could do that at that time a man was allowed to do. There were some jobs men weren't allowed to do, like taking the worms and bones out of the fillets.
Oh, I see.
For whatever reason,
Yeah.
men didn't do that. Anyways, I was continuing to learn my Icelandic. So at some point I crossed over and I knew enough words that I could understand a sentence, even if there were a couple of words I didn't know, and I could pick them up by context. And at that point, I started to learn very fast. And it was fun. I learned how to count playing the bingo. So I would sit down and you would have the bingo chips and you put them down. If you put on the wrong one, the people sitting beside you, usually a pretty girl, would help move the chips around. So I was learning Icelandic. I was learning how to count in Icelandic. And then my friends around Christmas, we were coming up to Christmas, and my two Canadian friends that I was living with, they decided they were going to go back home in the new year. So we celebrated Christmas in Hub and New Year's in Hub, and it was spectacular. Interestingly enough, a little side story. So we had gone to do Christmas shopping in November. We had flown to Reykjavik for a weekend to do some Christmas shopping. And because the Icelandic currency was so soft at that time, it was an incredibly high rate of inflation. You couldn't buy foreign currencies, not on the regular. You could on the black market, but if I wanted to sell my Canadian dollars, I could get double the going rate for them. I didn't, because I didn't want to screw people over. So I wasn't.
Right, sure.
But I knew that when I left the country, I was not going to be able to take any of the money. So I said, well, I may as well spend it. So I bought very expensive gifts for my parents and my grandparents and my siblings, and shipped them all off, and got rid of a bunch of my Icelandic money by sending gifts. As the people that I sent it to die, I get all those gifts back. So now I have these very beautiful sculptures.
So without even knowing it, you were making some very long-term investments.
Yeah, I had not anticipated, but it's amazing. And in my house now, I have these beautiful pieces of art that I bought in the 1970s.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah. So it's an interesting way to get money out. But so anyways, in the January of 75, my friends left. We went to Reykjavik. My friends left, and I relocated to a town called Grundarfjörður, which is right beside the very famous mountain Kirkjufell.
Okay.
So it's in the shadow of Kirkjufell.
Oh, wow.
From the side of the mountain where it doesn't look like Kirkjufell. Like if you go around Kirkjufell, like it's this beautiful spire, you go around the side, it just looks like a mountain, ordinary mountain. So I lived right beside it for a couple of months, or a month and a bit. I had no idea. It was not famous. It was just a mountain at the time. There was no special parking lot to take pictures of it. It had never been on a movie yet. So, but I lived in that town and worked in another fish factory. I lived with a friend of mine, Mike, and a girl so the three of us lived in it, me, Mike, and this girl. He was an Icelander, but had grown up in the U.S. for quite a bit. And I had met him in Hub. We had worked together in Hub. And so he had a job where after he got there, he owned a house. He was working on a fishing trawler. So he would be gone for a couple of weeks at a time. So basically it was just me and this lovely lady, and she could sing like Janis Joplin. But we were living and working, and it was a good time for a month and a bit, around a month. And then I got another job offer down the road, a couple of hours, not even a couple hours, half-hour drive, was a town called Ólafsvík.
Okay.
Which is basically right at the base of Snæfellsnes, and the mountain and the volcano, I mean. And I got a job on a fishing boat. So this was at the beginning of the cod fishing season. They huge shortage of sailors to work. So they would even hire somebody like me. I knew nothing. I was the lowest paid and the rookie on the boat. But we went out and started. I went out and started working on out at sea, which is fascinating. Probably the best job I've ever had.
Yeah. Wow.
But so, and we'll get into that in a minute.
Sure.
So if I back up, the other parts of my Icelandic experience, of course, was meeting people. I made a lot of friends. There was another friend of mine in Hub, Hornivir, that still lives there today. I've reached out, he's not reached back. But he was, again, an Icelander, but he had grown up in Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
Then had moved back home to Iceland. later in life due to problems with the law in the United States.
That sounds like a story.
Yeah, trafficking heroin and armed robbery, evidently.
Really?
But, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
okay.
So, anyways, he was he ended up now. I know that he went on in Iceland to be very respectful.
Sure.
He was the captain of a fishing boat, and and he was a very good friend. And then we would travel to Reykjavik and go and party. Again, it's interesting. I was 17 when I went there. The drinking age was 20, I believe. But this is kind of funny. I had just graduated from high school. In Canada, graduating from high school means you're probably 18 years old. In Iceland, if I say high school, they think háskóli, which is university. And if you graduated from university, you're probably mid-20s or older. So when I was in Hub and I was a graduate of high school, everybody assumed I was mid-20s, which meant when I wanted to go and buy a bottle of Brennivín, there was no liquor store in Hub. You had to go to the telegraph office and send a telegram to the capital city, to the liquor store, the ATVR, and order and pay for your bottle of Brennivín. And then they would ship it to you on Thursday.
Wow.
So you would order it by Tuesday, you would get it shipped on Thursday, then you would have it available for the weekend. So
it's like the Uber Eats for alcohol back in the day.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and everybody did that. So the Thursday plane was always full of it's, so I was that was part of my normal routine. And you would enjoy that and learn how to smuggle it into the dances, and it was part of the culture. At that time, teen alcoholism was a fairly significant issue in Iceland. They have since worked and corrected a lot of that. I helped contribute to the problem as a teen alcoholic in Iceland. So, but it was again, just part of the whole experience.
Yeah,
And I don't begrudge it at all. It was fascinating.
I mean, everything with a degree of moderation.
Well, there was no moderation to me, but yes, it would have been. Most Icelanders did have moderation.
Yeah, I mean, but of course, like you say, like this is something that it's your experience, so it is what it is.
Yeah.
Now, I have a question then, like in some way, do you think that actually helped you learning Icelandic? In some ways, like did you lose your inhibitions?
Oh, I spoke
Get
much
loosened up a bit?
Icelandic when I was half drunk.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I asked that. It's not a recommendation that should be given, but I did see that when I was in Iceland with some of the folks in our group, getting a little bit more loose with alcohol, and actually their Icelandic would be increased that way. And I was somewhere in the middle. Some folks would they would increase their Icelandic by doing great study and proper research and practice. Others would do it by like we say, maybe going out to the bars and interacting with the locals that way. And I watched kind of both ways, and I thought the end result of either way is kind of about the same.
Yeah. When you are learning by osmosis, which is what happens in the bar, and you aren't afraid to make a mistake, you learn a lot faster. If you say, I'm not going to say anything because I may say it wrong. And of course that disappears when you're under the influence of some kind of a relaxing drug like alcohol. And for sure, it was, I would say it probably did help me significantly. And in that, if I had gotten the job on the fishing boat first, I couldn't have used that. You can't be drinking and working on a fishing boat. If you're hungover on a fishing boat, it's a very ugly thing. You get very sick. I learned that.
Yes.
But so the work where I could, and it was only on the weekends that you would drink and go to the bars. But yeah, it definitely helped.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And people that are receiving your speech when you're talking are more receptive when they've been drinking.
Yeah, sure. Less judgmental maybe.
Yeah.
But besides that, and since we've taken this side tangent, I'll ask this now. Did you find that people were like more or less like when you're talking about just the whole lifestyle that you had there and the social outings and this and that, were people quite like welcoming? You know, when you would have the grade 1 level Icelandic language book, people didn't necessarily judge you. They were helpful, right?
They were very helpful. Again, there weren't a lot of tourists back then. In the early 70s, the tourists were a lot less. There were almost no tourists in January
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Iceland.
They didn't have the Aurora Borealis hype that
Exactly.
they promote nowadays.
And yet that was amazing to see,
I
especially like
imagine.
on the fishing boat.
Mm,
But yeah, it was definitely, I would actively have to ask them to not speak English
yes.
because I was learning
So
Icelandic.
even back then, they would
Yes.
speak English to you and they were accommodating if they knew English.
They would try to learn English as much as I was trying to learn. So
Okay.
they would have some, there was no internet. There was,
Mhm.
they would have some English movies,
Mhm.
some English on TV,
Mhm.
which only operated 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, and never in the summer.
Mm,
The TV was much different then.
mhm.
But you would have Radio Free Europe. So there would be could listen to English on Radio Free Europe,
Mm,
which was broadcast from a boat off the coast of somewhere.
mm.
But yeah, they the people my age
Mhm.
uh, could speak English way better than I could speak Icelandic,
Yeah.
and they wanted to learn how to speak it better.
Mm.
So my standard line was, "Look, I'm here in Iceland. You have to speak Icelandic with me. When you want to practice English, you come visit
Okay,
me in
yeah.
Canada." So it was, but
Uh-huh.
they were more than happy to help me learn. I
Mhm.
don't think I ever ran into anybody that was less than 100% behind me,
Mhm.
especially when they learned that I was a Western Icelander.
Yes, okay. That was gonna be my other question. How
Yes.
much do you think that in sort of, not to say improved your standing, but kinda made the connections even more real?
Oh, huge. So there are three types of people in the world. There are
Mhm.
Icelanders, there are Útlendingur, the foreigners, and then there are the Vestar Icelandingar.
Mhm.
So they found out I'm a Vestar Icelandinger. At each of the towns that I went to, you would have somebody would come up and say, "Where did your people come from?"
Mhm.
And I would tell them where my people came from, and they would say, "Oh, that's very interesting." They would go away, and 2 or 3 days, 4 days later, they would come back, and they would say, "We're related."
Mhm.
And they would say, "I want you to come over for dinner on Sunday,
Wow.
and I'm going to show you how we're related." So
Mm.
I would go over to their place for dinner on the Sunday. They would have on the kitchen table a piece of paper showing that somewhere,
Mhm.
6 generations back,
Mm.
we have a common ancestor. And then they would come back to me
Mhm.
and they would say, "See, we are related."
Mhm.
Now, they don't have the words for sixth cousin twice
Mm.
removed. It's
Mhm.
you're either friendly
Mhm.
and ekki friendly. So
Yeah,
you're either
yeah.
related or you're not. And once you're related at that time, probably similar today,
Mhm.
all the benefits of being a relative came into place, which meant if I needed laundry done, I could give them my dirty clothes and they would do my laundry. If if the if they asked me to help around the house, they knew I would say yes.
Mhm.
If they would offer me food and once or twice a week,
Mhm.
I could go and have a meal with them if I
Yeah.
wanted. Frequently, I didn't want to because I wanted to just be doing other stuff. But
Mhm.
yeah, it was so much fun. They
Yeah.
they they cared about that connection,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
yeah, and being a Vestar Icelandinger was, by the end of it, I started to feel and was treated more like a Icelandinger.
Wow.
I was becoming much more Icelandic than
Mhm.
Western Icelandic.
Mhm.
Uh, I have a funny story close to the end of my trip. I was, uh, you gotta make sure timing's,
Yeah, I'm all good as long as
yeah,
you are.
very
Yeah.
good.
Okay.
I Close to the end of my trip, what I would do when I would meet somebody I had never met
Mhm.
is I would see how long could I go speaking
Ah,
Icelandic before they would know I'm not Icelandic. Of course, my
interesting.
appearance was very Icelandic. I,
Mhm.
I was dressed in Icelandic clothes, 100% Icelandic DNA
Yeah.
almost.
Mhm.
So I am an Icelander. If you cut me in half and look, I'm Icelandic.
Yes.
The longest I ever lasted was almost 20 minutes.
Oh.
Now, I was drunk. The two young Icelanders, they my age, 20-year-old Icelanders, we were in a bar and the loud music was going on. They were also quite inebriated.
So you had a lot in your advantage.
A lot in my advantage. So we're talking, it's hard to hear, blah, 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 blah. I went to the washroom. When I came back, one of them said, "Where are you from?" So this is after almost 20 minutes. And I said, "Well, I'm from Canada." And I was quite happy that it had taken that long. They said, "We thought you were Icelandic, but we thought you were mentally challenged." So they had believed I was a mentally challenged. I had reached the level of a mentally challenged Iceland. My grammar, of course, wasn't correct. My pronunciation was fairly good, but my grammar was wrong, and my vocabulary was quite limited. Probably like a 5-year-old at the time. So it was, I felt a victory. If I had been able to do it for 5 minutes, it would be great. So if they had been sober and I was sober, it would have been 5 minutes. But yeah, it was part of the journey of doing what I wanted to do. When I came back to Canada, my first year of university, my notes, and I can't find them now. I'm sure they were thrown out. My notes that I would take during the lectures, I'm an engineer. If the Icelandic word was shorter, which doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen, I would write the Icelandic word. So my notes in my first year of engineering were a mix of Icelandic and English writing.
So you found like an actual way to incorporate it into your life. I think that's so key, because if it is just something that, oh, I'm only going to use it in Iceland because I want to connect with the people there, then you'll only use it when you're in Iceland. But if you use it in other ways in your life, then it'll actually become a part of, and I mean, I can totally tell, like when you say Icelandic words and when you speak it, you can tell that, oh yeah, this is someone who has actually used the language. It's not like you just picked it up just as something to learn. You actually have incorporated into your life.
Yeah. Sadly enough, after the trip in 74, 75, then when I left there, I had to leave some money in the bank. And I came back to Canada. A couple of years later, my grandmother died and left me some money, not a lot, and I went to my grandfather and I said, "I have this money from grandma." I said, "I have some money sitting in a bank in Iceland. I don't know how much is left because the inflation was higher than the interest rate." I said, "I will throw that money in a pot. You throw money in the pot. The two of us, we will go to Iceland for 3 weeks." So a couple of years, so I came back in 75. In 78, my grandfather and I went back for 3 weeks in the summer, just the two of us. And it was one of my highlight trips of my life.
How old was he then, roughly?
He would have been early 70s.
Oh, okay.
That time.
That's very cool.
Yeah, So it was amazing.
I imagine.
Yeah, he would wake up early every day, and I'd have to wake up because we shared a hotel room, or a room together in our relatives' places. We traveled around the country. And sorry about that.
That's all right.
I should put it on to
Sure.
turn off mode. So so my grandfather would wake me up early. When we were in Reykjavik, I would go out and party late.
And take that if you need to.
No.
Okay.
So anyways, it was a fascinating time to be there with my grandfather, just the two of us, and travel around, visit relatives. And again, because it was only a couple of years, I was still speaking Icelandic at a fairly high proficiency. And it was enjoyable to keep doing it. After that trip, a couple of years, after that trip, 5 years, my grandparents all died, or my grandfather went into dementia. So I quit using Icelandic at that time and didn't get to use it very much until many, many years later. But I was lucky because the age I was at, 17, 18 years, is an age where if you do incorporate it,
it's
part of the places where I really used it the most when I came back to Canada. My Ave he was born in Iceland, and his working language, he came over when he was very young, but he was very associated with all Icelanders. And he was a gruff, old, cranky man. My cousins who share him as a grandfather, not one of them liked him. They were afraid of him. But once I came back and I could talk to him in Iceland,
Wow.
him and I became very good friends. And he would tell me stories of growing up in Canada as an Icelander, and some of them were just hilarious. But all of a sudden, I wasn't just this annoying young person. I was able to talk to him in Icelandic. I was his daughter, my mother, spoke a little bit of Icelandic, but not much. I spoke it much better, and it fostered a connection with us that was powerful, and it was made me very happy. It was one of the biggest benefits.
Yeah, definitely.
And the same thing with my grandmother and my grandfather as well, being able to talk to them in Icelandic. And of course, my grandfather, he was quite a funny man. He was very big in the Icelandic community. He was the longest serving president of the Icelandic National League of North America in history.
Wow.
There's never been a longer serving president compared to my
And
grandfather.
his name again?
He was the Reverend Philip Petursson.
Okay.
His uncle was the founding president of the Icelandic National League of North America, Rögnvaldur Petursson. He would tell me these funny little stories in Icelandic, and then he would always end it with, "It's really funny because your brother and sisters are listening to us and they have no idea what we're saying." And
He got a kick out of that.
oh yeah, with the two of us, we would laugh and laugh.
Wow.
It allowed me to connect and cross the generations in a way that would have been impossible otherwise. In a way that's only uniquely that and you're speaking a language together that only 400,000 people in the whole world, can speak. Now it was less than. Which again makes you a member of a very elite club. Kind of a useless club sometimes, but an elite, but questionable whether it's useful.
That's really like the way you're describing this is so well said and so well put. And I have all the same sort of feelings around the language. Now, unfortunately, I think there's been some differences in my experience with it. Is just it's probably the case that English is even more prevalent now. And the internet changes things a lot too, because even when I do encounter areas where there is still a language barrier, that is resolved through using my phone, not through having to force myself to understand the language. But all the things that you're describing in that sort of elite club aspect to it, and it's useful in some ways, useless in other ways. I think about these too, and my analytical brain is always going like, well, how much time do I dedicate to learning this? Like, is there other things that in my personal life at this moment should I spend my time doing? And these kind of all get in the way. And I haven't spent the length of time that you have in Iceland either, but it's all very interesting. And since we've been talking about so much about the language, then I guess I would want to ask you now, how was your experience last night teaching? Is this your first time teaching an Icelandic language class?
Yes. Our regular teacher had come down ill, so the options were to cancel it, but it was late on Sunday when he reached out, or have me just try teaching it. And I enjoyed it immensely. It's again, I'm passionate about the language. Similar to our teacher, our instructor and myself both learned it the same way, though. We both learned it as Winnipeggers going over and living there and learning it through osmosis before the internet and before cell phones and stuff. So you learn it the way a child learns it. So I am not very good trying to explain the rules around grammar. To be honest, I'm bad telling the rules around grammar in English. So
Same.
You learned it because the words go together like this because it sounds right, or because that's the way I learned, and that's the way I am with Icelandic. So it makes it harder to, if somebody wants to know why is it this way, I have trouble saying it. but I can say this is the way it's said. So, but I enjoyed it immensely. I took one of my grade 1 readers. It's a book called Stuber. It's about a small boy who's too little, and he's got twin older brothers that are mean to him because he's so small, and there's 3 stories, and at the end they all become good friends because the little guy wins over his older brothers. But we read that and would read it in Icelandic, and then the translation, and read it in Icelandic and the translation, and it was very enjoyable. The When I was a kid, long before I learned Icelandic, again, I had heard it a bunch. My grandfather, the Reverend Phil Petursson, his hero was Stefán G. Stefánsson.
Okay.
He loved reading Stefan's poems. And as a child, I can remember sitting and he would read a poem and then he would translate it for me. So
Wow.
for him, it was practice as well. His native language was English, but he learned enough Icelandic. He was a minister, and he ministered in Manitoba in both languages, in the Unitarian Church. And it was fascinating because he would love to translate. So he would translate Stefán G. Stefánsson for me. But that's what it felt like for me tonight, because I'm sitting there and trying to translate, and I could always cheat and grab the phone and use it, but it was more fun to force myself.
Yeah. Well, that's what they say, right? The best way to learn is to teach.
Yeah.
And so for you as a teacher, or anyone who's in a teaching position, you get that personal benefit as well, of course.
I think if the internet had existed when I went over to Iceland, it would have been a lot harder for me to stay there as long as I did. I ended up having to leave there because my grandmother found out I was working on a fishing boat, and she got me kicked out. She would have found out quicker if I'd been taking selfies on the deck of a fishing boat. It was much, if I had had the ability to talk or FaceTime to my parents and friends in Canada and speak English to them and interact in English with my cell phone, it would have been a lot harder. I'll be honest, there were times when I was living there that I would cringe because I would just want the people to speak English. It was that was about the first 4 months where there would be times when I was just, it felt uncomfortable because everybody kept talking this gibberish.
But that difficulty is important in learning something.
Yes.
You have to just go through it.
Yeah.
And like you say, in today's world, it is so easy to just, okay, this is too difficult, and then you pull out a tool to help you.
Yeah. And then, it helps you, but it helps you understand the way moment. But
But long term could be
I had a huge benefit. I also was a big benefit just being able to be away and living in a distant land, which is a lot closer than you would think. But
it's especially a lot closer with the internet. Everything is much closer in the modern world.
Yeah.
So I imagine even then, not 1600s time long ago, but still that amount of time is enough that it really was, in some sense, a different world.
Yeah. Like you say, even television. You couldn't stream on a phone, but even television only operated 3 hours a day, right?
Yeah.
It was completely different. The only real English I would have is at night I could pick up the English radio, the Radio Free Europe.
Yeah.
In the mornings you couldn't. Once the sun was starting, for whatever reason, the atmospheric conditions had to be right.
Oh, interesting.
You could only pick up, and the rules were the base on Keflavik had to have it set up so that they could only broadcast to themselves.
Okay.
So I would have my little travel clock radio that my uncle had given me that had a radio alarm on it. When it would pop open, it would be an Icelandic station. And I would wake up to an Iceland. The timing was such that I would always wake up to go to work with an exercise show. So I learned the word for right and left. So vinstri hægri was what I woke up to every morning.
Wow. Yeah. Well, these have been very interesting stories. And we kind of, it's cool, this arc of how we've been discussing these things, kind of bringing it from the present to the past and connecting these things. Now, there are some other areas that we could go to, and we kind of cut short. I think you hinted a little bit at the cod fishing. and what was going on around that time. But you can give us a little teaser, and we're going to have to get back together for a future podcast. But tell folks a little bit what they can expect of some other stories you can share with us.
So there are interesting stories in the fish factories when I worked. There was interesting stories in working construction with crazy people, but then also working on the fishing boat was a highlight of probably my working life of all time, my whole life. On the good days, good weather days, you'd be up on the deck between nets. You would lay out they had 7 nets laid out. Each day you would pick them up, empty the fish out, put them back, and then you would motor for half an hour between them. On the really good days, you'd be standing on the front. It would be like I'm on the front of that Titanic, and the dolphins would be diving up out of the water, and you would have 5 or 6 dolphins running ahead of the boat. And on the bad days, which were amazing, the seas would be so high that you would be down in the trough between waves, and you would be looking up at a 45-degree angle to the top of the next wave, and your legs would be, even when you're doing nothing, your whole body is fighting against the boat moving. So my core strength and my leg strength, and I was in better shape than you could ever imagine. And we would be pulling the fish from the sea, and just everything was amazing. At one point, the seas were dead calm. It was pitch black. I got the captain to shut off the engines and the lighting motor, so we were completely dead in the sea, and I could hear the northern lights.
Wow, the crackling sort of.
Crackling. And the lights were so bright that you could see them reflected in the fish blood on the boat. So it was, working on the boat, and we were involved, and I was affected by the actual cod war. So there was one day we had our boat was damaged, and we had to wait for the Coast Guard to come, and they couldn't tell us, because then the Brits would know how far away they were.
Wow. Okay.
We'll sit down again sometime, and I'll just talk about my jobs.
Yeah.
The working in the herring factory and working on the fishing boat, and it was spectacular.
Yeah, well, that sounds quite amazing. We usually like to, not like to, but oftentimes these podcasts sort of end on a note of poetry, which you mentioned the references to Stephen G. And then I think just the imagery of the Northern Lights like that's poetic in and of itself. So I think this is a perfect place to put a pin in it. And I will look forward to sitting down with you again, Mark.
Yes.
Thank you for this.
Thank you. And thank you to Icelandic Roots.
Yeah, certainly so. They are kind of like the force that connects a lot of the distant Icelandic North American clubs to Iceland. I mean, there's a lot of different forces like this, but I think a lot of that is sort of brought together. And if we're talking about technologies, this is one of the great benefits of the world that we live in today.
Exactly.
In this way that we're all connected through things like this.
Yeah, my family had to go and spend 3 days. Now they can just buy me lunch now.
Yes, sure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
It was fun.
Thank you all for listening.